Welcome to the 99, where we are focused on brewing a better competitive commander. I'm your host, Patrick Marlette, and today I have an excellent list that I just cooked up about 3 days ago. Today we'll be discussing Neheb Dreadhorde Champion. This came out in War the Spark, and to be honest, I didn't really give it thorough consideration until after Justin and I shot the set review. If you haven't seen that yet, I'll leave a link in the description for you so you can see our thoughts, listen to our thoughts on the recent set that just released. And when I saw Neheb, I immediately thought, well, there's some potential here. I don't know what potential, because I never really researched into infinite combat, infinite turn strategies in mono red. However, upon further inspection, there was a lot to dig into, and I was just so excited about this deck, I cut everything else off the schedule because I wanted to talk about the Dreadhorde Champion. We'll be filming this deck tech a little differently, as filming this, War the Spark hasn't officially released. However, there are pre-releases happening now, and as a matter of fact, I technically own all of the cards for this deck. They have just yet to arrive. However, I have tested this deck out numerous times, and I can tell you that it's really good. With this deck tech more than ever, I'm going to encourage you to follow the link in the description over to Tapped Out to check out the list to infinity and beyond for Neheb, the Dreadhorde Champion, not Buzz Lightyear. We are about 95% of where I want to be with this deck. There are alternative forms of removal I have yet to play with, and of course, things like Double Strike, mechanics like that would obviously benefit Neheb, but have yet to be tested. And I've looked over them, I've tried them out in goldfishing, I've yet applied them in a 4-man commander game. However, I think the deck is rock solid where it is, but nothing is ever truly complete. There's always ways to improve these decks. So now more than ever, I will definitely be happy and open to any criticisms on the deck, and of course, ways to improve it. Let's see if we can't work on this deck together to make the best Neheb Dreadhorde Champion list. And on that note, if there are any card-related questions on this list, of course, I'm going to do a follow-up video to this core strategy video discussing the notable inclusions and exclusions to this deck, and of course, how you want to go about playing this during a game. But why don't we start by talking about Neheb, the Dreadhorde Champion. And of course, I have my laptop in front of me today. Again, I don't have any of the cards in hand yet. I've been playing with proxies. It's good. But Neheb Dreadhorde Champion is 2 generic and 2 red. It has trample, and of course, whenever Neheb Dreadhorde Champion deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you may discard any number of cards. If you do, draw that many cards and add that much mana. Until the end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. Now, this plays a major part in how the deck ultimately wins. There's a 1-card combo for Neheb, barring that you have 5 cards in hand. If you have Aggravated Assault on deck, you can discard the 5 cards, get 5 mana, take an additional combat step, and continually attack during your turn, whatever turn that might be. So aside from the Neheb Dreadhorde combo with Aggravated Assault, we have 2 more, that being Combat Celebrant and Kiki-Jiki. This is a really nice, compact method of getting an alternative reoccurring combat step in this deck that doesn't eat away at the main strategy, but plays along with it really nicely. I will state that Kiki-Jiki by himself is kind of useless in this deck outside of these combos, so he just becomes fodder for Neheb to discard. However, if you do have either one of these components, either Combat Celebrant or Breath of Fury, which is our 3rd option, then we might want to consider holding on to Kiki-Jiki as we go about looting. And of course, we'll discuss that more in depth in just a second. But our win cons moving forward are Combat Celebrant, Kiki-Jiki, or Breath of Fury, any non-legendary creature, and Kiki-Jiki. And of course, I'll explain how these loops work in a second. But aside from those 3 options, we can pretty much go off with non-infinite combat and likely damage out the board with commander damage. You don't always have to go infinite for this deck to work. However, we are aiming to take infinite combat steps. That's why the deck is named To Infinity and Beyond. There's more than we can do outside of these infinite loops. Now, this might be old news to some, but just to make sure we're on the same page with how the deck wins, before we cut into the strategy of the deck, I do want to go over these last 2 win conditions, that being Combat Celebrant and Kiki-Jiki, as well as the Breath of Fury and Kiki-Jiki combo. So let's first talk on the Combat Celebrant loop. With Combat Celebrant on the field, and of course he is a 2 generic 1 red creature, human warrior. He has the ability that if he exerts himself when he attacks, you get to untap all other creatures you control, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. Note that you don't get an additional main phase. That's important in some situations. And Kiki-Jiki, the great combo enabler himself, he is a 2 generic, 3 red legendary creature, Goblin Shaman. Now he has haste and the ability to create a token of a non-legendary creature you control. That token has haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of your next end step. Well, we're not trying to make it all the way to our end step. We're trying to damage out people now. So if Combat Celebrant has haste or has gone over his summoning sickness by being cast on your previous turn, you can tap and exert him. Now, when his trigger ability hits the stack, we'll go ahead and tap our Kiki-Jiki, creating a copy of this Combat Celebrant. So he'll untap all other creatures to include our Kiki-Jiki, and now we have a little bonus Combat Celebrant here and a new attack phase. When this one goes to attack, we'll also exert him and do the same trick with Kiki-Jiki, creating a copy of the new Combat Celebrant. So as you can see, we're going to make an arbitrary number of Combat Celebrants that will all go about untapping each other. And if we want, Neheb can throw his hat in the ring too, but this alone should damage out the board. Of course, if there's someone with a lot of dorks or just creatures on deck, that could stop the combo because Celebrant is only a 4/1 body. So I'm going to advise you attack other players first and then deal with the guy who's playing his green deck with ramp. Now the Breath of Fury loop is just a little bit more confusing, but not that bad at all. So long as you have a non-legendary creature on deck, you're going to attach Breath of Fury to that creature. This is a rather mana-intensive way to get infinite combat, and it's kind of important to note that you're going to want to do this before your first combat or just have the mana prerequisite to cast an additional combat phase card, which we can talk about in a second. But with that non-legendary creature, Kiki-Jiki, and Breath of Fury out, you're going to go to combat. The creature that has Breath of Fury attached to it will ultimately do damage to a player. Now, when that triggered ability hits the stack, it's important to note that, and this is how Breath of Fury reads, it's a 2 generic, 2 red, enchanted creature you control. When an enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice it and attach Breath of Fury to a creature you control. It doesn't target a creature. There doesn't need to be a creature on deck for this effect to work. So at that point, we'll tap Kiki-Jiki to copy the creature that it's attached to. And remember, Kiki-Jiki's ability gives that creature haste. Now, with the new copy of whatever that non-legendary creature is, Breath of Fury is going to kill the original and go onto the copy. We get an additional combat phase after this because if you do, untap all your creatures you control, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So again, very similar to Combat Celebrant. However, we are losing a creature in the process. This is not as effective as the other two methods, and again, it's a little bit more mana intensive, but it doesn't require much on our part to set up. So I do like that, and it's only one additional card in the deck with a Breath of Fury, that is, because we're going to use Kiki-Jiki in that other combo. I like it. It's fine. There might be a better strategy if you guys want to throw your hat in the ring in regards to different combat strategies we should be going for. I like these three the best, the obvious one being Aggravated Assault and Neheb, but the other two I think fit into this deck very nicely. Now we know how the deck wins. It's fairly obvious. We're going to take a lot of combat steps, and I know a lot of folks who are strategizing this list currently will avoid the extra turn cards. I know it makes the deck seem like a glass cannon, but I do want to discuss what we'll be looting for. So if you're following along on the primer, I actually have mine up currently, we're going to go to the second step, which is the attacking. And it's what we're looting for or looking for as we play through this turn, whatever turn that might be. There are some instances where you might have Neheb out on turn 2. In most cases, we'll get him comfortably out onto and attacking by turn 3. I should state, there are ways to get him out on turn 2 and attacking on turn 2, but we're going to focus on turn 3. Now you're going to have to read the board here a little bit. Obviously, if someone has mana open and available, I would highly suggest when you go into the attack, considering what options you have in your hand that you should keep. And generally speaking, those should be Bolt Bend, Ricochet Trap, Red Elemental Blast, and Pyro Blast. It's going to be the blue player. It's going to be the blue player that goes to stop you. And you're going to want to have some form of countermeasure or some way to interact with a bounce effect, because you can sure bet that someone is going to try to into the royal your Neheb, and you're going to want some form of countermeasure for that. So if your hand has 5 cards or 6 cards in it, note that it should be, that -1 for the Neheb effect, because we're going to try to hold that 1 card up. And of course, they're going to have to do this in reaction to the triggered effect hitting the stack. So say you get past that and you have 5 cards left. You discard down the 5, you get 5 mana. That 5 mana is red. You get to keep it until the end of turn. Great. What are you looking for? What do you want to cast with that? The main things I consider when we're going into an attack are your wheel effects and your extra combat effects. The perfect hand will have ideally a wheel and or an extra combat effect. Now, if they don't, we're hoping to pull into one of those 2 things. Now, our wheel effects for this deck are Wheel of Fortune, Reforge the Soul, Winds of Change. It's a wheel, but it does net you 1 less card because you have to play it. It's an honorary wheel. What's nice about it is it does affect your opponent's hands, and by this point they've likely tutored for something they needed, and or it's likely going to affect them negatively. However, that's not the only wheel. We have Memory Jar. Runehorn Hellkite is an interesting one. Now, these cards should be up on the screen as we're going through these so you can read over them, but Runehorn Hellkite's a bit of an oddity. I don't think you've seen him. You've likely seen Wheel of Fortune, Reforge the Soul, Winds of Change, Memory Jar. You've seen those. But this guy's interesting. He's 5 generic and 1 red. Not difficult to put out. We're not trying to play him, though. It's a creature dragon with flying, and he has an effect in the graveyard. I love it when cards have activated abilities in the graveyard, because I'm telling you, no one runs Stifle. So it's the same as his casting cost. Pay 5 generic and 1 red. Exile Runehorn Hellkite. Damn, we're never going to see him again. So you exile him from your graveyard. Each player discards his or her hand, then draws 7 cards. It is exactly Wheel of Fortune. Obviously, a little bit more expensive than Wheel of Fortune, but an excellent card nonetheless, because we're going to be playing through our turns with a Neheb, discarding cards, getting mana, discarding cards, getting mana, and we'll likely have the mana prerequisite for that ability. And before you go to loot again, which is essentially what Neheb is doing, this is a great effect to have in your graveyard that you can play out. And the last major wheel is Null Spine Dragon. This is a weird one as well. It's a little mana intensive, but it's so worth it. So Null Spine Dragon, he should be on the screen now. He's 5 generic, 2 red, creature dragon, flying. Very similar to our other dragon, the Hellkite over there. When Null Spine Dragon comes into play, you may discard your hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to target opponent this turn. Well, if that opponent didn't feel bad enough taking 15 from Neheb, he's going to feel really awful once you've drawn 15 cards off of Null Spine Dragon. Now, here's what I'm going to recommend. Before you play any of these wheels, play out as much as you can, and then play the wheel, obviously, aside from Winds of Change, because Winds of Change is going to require you have somewhat of a hand left, but this is going to give you a flush hand to go into the attack phase and have more to discard, to draw from, and to gain mana from to take subsequent attack phases. Now, on the attack, we're also looking for looting effects. There's only 3 in the deck outside of Neheb's own triggered ability, that being Cathartic Reunion, Faithless Looting, and Magmatic Insight. And Cathartic Reunion you might not have heard of. Faithless Looting we all know, and Magmatic Insight is one that's poorly represented. No one ever plays this card. I absolutely love it. Why don't we talk about that one first? It's 1 red, and as an additional cost you have to discard a land. Boo-hoo. You draw 2 cards after the fact. So this, if you have 5 cards in hand, will still give you like net neutral on cards, because when you play this and discard a card, you'll still have 5 cards in hand, and hopefully it won't be a land and or Magmatic Insight or anything equivalent to that. Basically what I'm saying is, when you play these looting cards, what you're trying to do is get to that extra combat, or if you find yourself slow rolling from your combat phases, like if you feel you're ultimately going to wind down, you're not going to be able to continue this loop of attacks, this will hopefully set you up for the next turn. Now, I want to talk about next turn cards before we talk about additional combat cards. Those are self-explanatory. We don't really need to go over those. You want to be attacking in this deck, and obviously if you get enough attacks out, you likely will commander damage someone out before you even get to the rest of the board. But the extra turn cards, in case you feel like, again, you're slow rolling, you're gonna whiff, Last Chance, Warrior's Oath, and Final Fortune. Now, 2 of these are sorcery speed, 1 of these are instant speed, that's Final Fortune, which is kind of important to note for those that use Isochron Scepter. But Last Chance, Warrior's Oath, and Final Fortune all cost 2 red, and they all have the same effect. You take an extra turn after this one, and at the end of that turn, you lose the game. It's kind of crazy, but if you feel like you're going to whiff and you have a hand that's has some protection maybe, or a form of removal in one of these, and maybe you have like 5 or 6 cards in that hand and you don't have an extra combat at this point, or another wheel to get into an extra combat, these are good for setting you up on your next turn. You should highly consider playing this then and just go at it one more time. If you lose, you lose. If you win, well, then you're going to win big. And on that note, our extra combats are Fury of the Horde, Relentless Assault, Seize the Day, the best one, honestly, the sickest one, Ardent everything, and World at War, as well as, you know, our flagship card here, Aggravated Assault. This is the one that works best with Neheb, obviously. But Fury of the Horde is the most expensive. It's 5 generic and 2 red. You can exile cards, 2 red cards from your hand to cast it instead. But basically, and a lot of these have the same effect in text. Some have single targets, some untap all targets, but this one says untap all target creatures that attacked this turn. After this main phase, there's an additional combat phase, followed by additional main phase. And going down the list, Relentless Assault is the same thing, untap all creatures, same effect. Seize the Day, this is untap target creature. Note that the creature is usually going to be Neheb. What's beautiful about this card is it has a flashback effect that costs 1 less than it. Both Relentless Assault and Seize the Day cost 4, but Seize the Day costs 3 generic, 1 red, and then 2 generic, 1 red for the flashback. Really beautiful. And then World at War is 5 mana. What's nice about this is it's an additional combat, but with rebound. So if you have to use an extra turn, this is always lovely to have exiled, because you're going to be able to cast that and get an additional combat. So whatever the amount of cards you have in hand, you'll be able to get, well, twice that much more, technically, moving forward. The last cards I want to talk about, the cards you should be looting for, are honorary mentions. They really depend on the board state, and these are the ones I'm going to go into in depth. I feel like everything else up to this point is fairly self-explanatory. You guys know that you want to cast Neheb very soon. You want to have some form of protection, some form of removal. Things like Silent Gravestone, things like Grafdigger's Cage are going to hold us down. Mana Dorks are going to hold us down. So seeing those cards on the list, like the Pyroclasms of the World, the Electricery in my sideboard, things like that, to remove those dorks, remove those objects, and all the artifact hate, fairly obvious. But these cards are a little different, and this one just came out. It's Finale of Promise, X and 2 red. If you watched our set review, you heard us talk about this. But you may cast up to 1 target instant and or up to 1 target sorcery card from your graveyard, and obviously there's the ability of casting it for 10 or more. If X is 10 or more, copy those spells twice. You may choose new targets for the copies. So what's crazy about this, it's almost like a lesser, Mizzix Mastery in this deck. Not that Mizzix is better than it. Again, they're all situational, but Finale of Promise is going to let us say we don't have enough mana to do something in our turn. We can recast our Seething Song and then recast whatever the heck else we want. Finale of Promise is usually targeting one of 2 things. It's going to target either one of our wheels and or extra combats, as well as, and generally speaking, I found that I've targeted these most, it's going to hit something like a ritual to give us a little bit more mana going into that next turn, whatever our setup might be. Heck, you can hit cards like, and I need to look it up, this card right here, Shreds of Sanity, if you really need it, if you just want to have the cards in hand. And Shreds of Sanity is great because that 1 card puts 2 cards in your hand, again, depending on your graveyard. But Finale of Promise, excellently utility knife in this deck, and I hinted on it a second ago, Mizzix Mastery, if you've never heard of it, it's an overload card, but for 3 and 1 red, exile target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard. For each card exiled this way, copy it, and you may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So where Finale of Promise has the potential to duplicate an instant or sorcery of X and or less, you, with Mizzix Mastery, have the ability to copy every instant and sorcery in your deck. And when you have something like 20 plus cards in your graveyard, you're going to be doing some crazy things if you're able to overload Mizzix Mastery. And again, it's not very difficult, because consider that when you discard cards, you're getting mana. Again, that overload cost is not difficult to hit. And this is where you want all of those rituals of yours in the graveyard. Trust me, when you just get to go off with this and have a mess of mana in the aftermath, that's a beautiful thing. Mizzix Mastery is an excellent utility knife for the deck. And of course, Past in Flames, very self-explanatory. If we're not pulling more extra turns, or rather extra combats, we can get them by playing Past in Flames and giving that thing a flashback cost. And of course, it itself has flashback, so it's going to allow us to use our utilities again, as well as our, extra turns, extra combat, extra whatever we need in our graveyard. And along the same lines, we have Recoup. It only targets sorcery cards. It's 1 red and 1 generic. Target sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until the end of the turn. The flashback cost is equal to its mana cost. So whether it comes to Past in Flames or Recoup, if there is X in the value of the mana cost, you will still pay that X value for whatever you want. There aren't too many cards in this deck with X in the mana cost, but that's something you should note moving forward when you play these cards. They might open up more potential depending on where you are and where your board state is. And lastly, the honorary mentions that you should be looting for are Shreds of Sanity, Coveted Jewel, Kiki Jiki. We've already touched on him. You might not always want him in hand. Most of the times he can just be discard fodder. And Increasing Vengeance. So Increasing Vengeance is like Fork and Reverberate, but only on your spells. And what it allows you to do is for 2 red, copy target instant or sorcery spell that you control. If Increasing Vengeance was cast from your graveyard, copy that spell twice. You may choose new targets for the copies. Its flashback is high. It's 3 generic and 2 red. However, it's really good for doubling down on those extra combats. I really love the card in this deck. It's why it's in the deck. Coveted Jewel is an oddity. I've already been asked about it. I think for 6 generic, it's not hard to put on the field. Mind you, when you go into attack with Neheb on that turn, you likely have whatever rocks you had available and whatever lands you had available at the start. So that's mana on deck for this, should you choose to cast it. What I love about this card is that for 6 mana, you get 3 mana back when it's cast, 3 mana of any one color, if you've never heard of Coveted Jewel. 6 generic. When Coveted Jewel enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards, and you're able to tap it for 3 mana of any color. The only downside is if someone does combat damage to you. No, whenever 1 or more creatures an opponent's controls attacks you, and you aren't blocked, so combat damage, that player draws 3 cards and gains control of Coveted Jewel. Untap it. So obviously there's a negative there. We're going to leave something up to block this if we play this. We should definitely plan to leave something up to block if we play this. However, it's not game ending, but it does net you 2 cards as well as replacing itself with that draw 3. And again, it's only technically 3 mana to play it. I really love it in this deck. I think it's been very effective in my testing. And of course, time will tell against other decks how effective it really is. And Shreds of Sanity, I already touched on. I'm just going to go over it again. It's 2 generic, 1 red. Return up to 1 target instant card and 1 target sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand, then discard a card. Exile Shreds of Sanity. Well, you know what? It's an excellent card. It has an excellent effect. You're going to want to use it to replay cards that give you extra combat. It's a fairly obvious inclusion. It's even cheaper to play when you have a medallion out. Obviously, there's a lot of benefits to this being in red. Red doesn't have very many recovery cards, and this is a really great one. I'm surprised that it's in red at all. So the basic strategy here is attack, rinse, and repeat. It's not difficult to do. It's actually very fun to do, and there's very little that inhibits Neheb from getting the job done. That's why I love this deck. And the spontaneity of it, it's almost like playing Selvala in that you don't know what happens until you roll the dice. Well, Neheb is very much that same type of commander. So far from all my testing, I absolutely love the deck strategy here. Of course, like I said off the bat, this deck isn't 100%. It might not ever be 100%. With more and more cards releasing and more effects that can come into play with this deck strategy, it will change how effective this deck is. And I still think that there's room to improve here, but I wanted to share the list with you guys. The core strategy is very simple, and obviously moving forward and with your advice, let's make a better Neheb Dreadhorde champion. Cards like Blood Mist, that's a thing I want to test out, but just haven't had the opportunity to try quite yet. I do think it's a little mana intensive. You might want to use a one-shot for that, but consider this: if you play a double strike card and it doesn't get countered or Neheb doesn't get bounced in the interaction, you'll be able to go through, let's just say we had 4 cards left in hand. Double strike has a different damage step as opposed to regular damage, so that's going to trigger Neheb twice. It's definitely worth something to consider if you're able to dig and gain more mana just that much more effectively. However, there aren't that many great double strike granting cards. I do want to narrow that list down, but the deck is forever changing. As I said, I'm going to change it as we go along, but I did want to share this primer with you guys. I think the strategy here is very sound. I'm very excited to showcase this in a Brew Wars, and I'll state on the show right now, Godo's got company, and Neheb is truly worthy. I think this has the potential to be a great cEDH commander, and I'd love to see what you guys are brewing too. So if you're also working on your own list, let me know what that list is in the comment section down below. Of course, if you like my list, feel free to like that list, share that list. I want to continue working on this idea because he's such a cool legendary. I can't believe how much of a sleeper card he was for me. I should have immediately known he'd be awesome, but I'm just so impressed with how he came out. That's why we're doing the video today. And of course, follow along for our part 2 on this guy. I'm going to have the rest of the deck like early May, so we should definitely get some gameplay footage soon with Neheb Dreadhorde champion. And that is it for our part 1 video. Thank you for joining me today. Again, leave any of your thoughts on the deck in the comment section down below. And of course, if you're excited to see it in Brew Wars, let's go ahead and talk about ways to improve this deck so I make sure it smashes face against that Food Chain, Niv Mizzet, and anything else that wants to fight Neheb. Again, my name is Patrick Marlatt, and thank you for joining me on the 99.